Welcome to Data Matters. It's another beautiful day in the UK's lockdown. I'm joined as usual by my business partner, Steve Wright. Hello,
Hi.
Steve.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're dialing in from.
We're really happy this week to be joined by Julia Porter.
Hello there.
Hi, Julia. Julia is a partner at the freshly relaunched Data Protection Network Associates, and we're also joined by Nick Graham.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Nick is a partner at the world's largest law firm, Dentons. So, Julia and Nick are today going to help us unpack what are the founding principles of the GDPR: lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization and accuracy, affectionately known by many of us just as lawfulness. I actually said to Steve this morning, this really could do with some pictures, so I think we'll take a look at perhaps putting together an infographic to try and explain this afterwards. So if an organisation is really looking at solidifying brand trust around how it takes care of people's data, this really is an area that we know we need to get right. So are you really allowed to do that with my data? Are you being clear enough with me about it, what it is you're doing with my data? And is that all you're doing with it? Do you really need so much information, and have you recorded it correctly? Now, these are the sort of questions I know that I would be asking, or I will be asking, if I have to share my personal data, for example, with the test and trace system. So without further ado, let's go over to our guests and get their expert opinion on what these principles really mean, particularly for organisations and individuals. And so I'm going to start with Nick. So Nick, can you help us with those definitions of lawfulness and purpose limitation as a starting point, please?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this obviously will be familiar to people from the old rules, and we find with these rules that they've been fleshed out, made more prescriptive under GDPR. This is not news. So lawfulness is, people tend to think of that as in relation to the gateway conditions, or what I call the gateway conditions, so Articles 6, 9 and 10, 6 and 9 in particular. But don't forget, there's a general principle of lawfulness under Principle 1. So Article 5.1a talks just very, very briefly about lawfulness as well as fairness and transparency. So anything that is unlawful is a breach of that principle. And therefore, don't forget the hidden points here, which is that data might be eligible for confidentiality protection under an employment contract, under a consumer contract, under a commercial contract. So as soon as you breach those confidentiality provisions, you're in breach of the general principle on lawfulness. Also, with consumer data, you might agree customer ownership terms with a third party. If you use the data outside those customer ownership permissions, then again, that would be a breach of contract, therefore unlawful. So that's, I mention that first because it's the general point, and sometimes it's kind of easy to forget about that. And then of course you've got the actual conditions, the lawful basis for processing, similar to the old rules. And the way, honestly, I would sum it up is they didn't 100% work in the old world, and they still don't 100% work in the new world. And, you know, Vickie, you mentioned about the COVID issue and contact tracing. So, you know, there's been a lot of debate, and we've had lots of discussions with our counterparts across the Dentons network in the rest of Europe on, can I temperature check? Can I test my staff for COVID positive status? And the ICO has been quite clear that a lot of that falls within Article 9.2b, so the health and safety employment law condition, but you get a different answer in different member states of the EU. So it can be a very fragmented position. So it feels to me like it's a combination, and this is what we have to grapple with. It's quite a prescriptive regime, but it's quite the levers you've got to pull as the data protection officer are still not well honed. So you can still end up in quite complex, quite difficult situations. And in other words, there's a risk, there's subjectivity. Apart from, and I would just say another example of that is there's public health, public interest conditions under Article 6 that are not terribly helpful when it comes to temperature checking and using data to fight the COVID virus and contact tracing and so on. you're probably better off relying on health and safety as a function of employment law. But again, another good example of why sometimes these conditions are not, they're not as slick, far from being as slick as they should be. So that's lawfulness. Shall I just talk a little bit about purpose limitation?
Yes, please, absolutely.
So this, I think back sort of 5 or 10 years, this was kind of a good general principle that we all knew we had to comply with, but really it didn't attract a lot of attention. It's been made more prescriptive under GDPR. So you've really got to nail the particular purpose you're going to use the data for, be clear about that at the outset. All good stuff so far. The real challenge with purpose limitation is what do you do when you want to step outside that? Because, hey, things change. Thinking about AI, thinking about medical research, but just sticking just briefly initially with the legal rules. So you've got the general principle, be clear about the purpose and don't do something different that's incompatible. That's the key word with the original purpose. What's interesting is that Article 6.4 contains a compatibility test around what's the type of data, what's the relationship between the parties, what are the safeguards, and I would just, to close on this point, I would just say that leaves a subjective decision for the controller, which, hey, it's a good thing that you have some flexibility. It's also a challenge because you've got flexibility, so the regulator may disagree, other controllers may take a different view, and so the rule, as I would summarize the rule as, it's purpose centric. So don't do process data for a different purpose, but remember it's about the purpose. So if you're doing processing for the same purpose in a different way, then I think that's okay. There's subjectivity, of course, but the core point is to ensure you're not doing something for a different purpose, or that you can justify it as being compatible. And again, COVID data, contact tracing, if we have a centralized database, as seems to be the plan, there may well be things that we don't know now that we know in the future that would mean we'd want to use that data for something that could be deemed to be a new purpose. And that is still the challenge.
Great, thanks, Nick. That was so helpful. I think, that practical advice really for people that, as you say, may often be really grappling with these two, particularly around lawfulness. As you mentioned, things can be so subjective. It's quite refreshing, actually, that you mentioned, there are other laws that perhaps are, are more fitting in some cases for this. And we have to remember that, the GDPR is only 2 years young still. So it is going to take some time to get these things right. Great. So, Julia, if we could move over to you just to talk about the other two then, the data minimization and accuracy.
This is the area that no one really wants to spend any time on because it's somewhat unfashionable, I suppose. But what we really need to think about is what data we're going to hold on to, and we need to make sure that we think about whether it's no more and for no longer than is absolutely necessary. So in the article, there's 3 key words. There's adequacy, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. So, you want to know that you've got sufficient data to properly fulfill your stated purpose. So that's kind of straightforward. You don't have to have no data. Is it relevant? Does the data you've got, is it relevant to your purpose? And then finally, you need to limit what is necessary. And I think this is where people get into a bit of a muddle, because it means that you've got to be constantly spring cleaning and constantly cleaning out your old data and creating systems and processes for making sure you're not holding on to it for any longer than you need to. And I guess the other part of that, which makes life hard, particularly when you're looking at technology, is this point about accountability, because you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've put all these processes in place and that you can show someone else what it is you've done. And I think when we come on to it later on, this catches a lot of people out.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great point that you mentioned around the accountability piece, of course. So Nick, kind of back to you. I think we've started to unpack this, but it'd be great to dig into a bit more about how you've seen this area move on and change since the introduction of the GDPR.
Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of what I would say is in terms of lawfulness, things have become more prescriptive. And I think partly that's a function of the fact, something I didn't mention in a moment ago, which is it's not just a matter of ensuring you've got a gateway condition on a lawful basis and that you're not tripping up over an employment contract or customer ownership clause. It's also that you've got to document that function of GDPR and accountability. So these conditions are going to appear in your privacy notice. They're going to appear in your Article 30 records. So one of the big changes, I think, is that, and this is outlined in some of the ICO guidance, that you really have to nail yourself to a particular condition or gateway. And we all know, I think one of the challenges is that in a typical example of processing, you're probably going to be able to rely on more than one of the conditions, and then you have a choice. And I think the old process, the old idea was, well, that's okay. You have a choice. There are several conditions you could rely on, most typically legitimate interests along with some of the others. But now you've really got to be clear, because you can't just jump around from one condition for processing to another. So I think, and that presents challenges, because when you really investigate this and really sort of peel the onion layers back, actually there are pros and cons of different legal bases. And in the end, a decision needs to be made, a practical decision. But I think that's one of the big challenges. And I think in terms of purpose limitation, one of the challenges with purpose limitation is the agile way in which technology develops and is developing, and some of the tools that are available to be used means that it's hard to be clear at the outset of exactly what purpose you want to use the data for. And so if we take, say, medical research, for example, you may well have a general purpose in mind, but the investigation and the analytics may lead you in a different direction. And so one answer is, well, you've got to go back and collect consent or check the compatibility criteria. But is that, in terms of ethics, is that actually the best approach? Is that actually limiting the value of the data? I mean, inevitably, yes. Or you could take I use that example because I think it makes the point more powerfully. You could use the example in relation to use of customer data for marketing and so on. But actually, let's take the extreme case. So we've got a data set, we're investigating purpose X in connection with medical research. Actually, the analysis takes you in a different direction. How do you operationalize that? Is that really a matter of going back and collecting consent? And is that striking the right balance? So I think there's some really, in some sectors, there are some very challenging issues there.
Absolutely. And Julia, could you build on that from what you've seen around these implementation challenges from a legal and a logistical perspective?
Certainly, my experience is largely in the commercial sector, but I think a few interesting challenges arose. First of all, in many organisations, they simply didn't know what data they had. And what I was really surprised at is quite how siloed organisations were around how they manage their data. So simply the exercise of figuring out what data sat where and who used it for what turned into a major exercise. And I've had a few clients that I've really struggled with on that. And then the second point, which Nick mentioned, is the chopping and changing of legal basis. So actually, right in 2015, before GDPR even came in, you had organisations saying, right, okay, we're going to go for consent only. So RNLI, actually, the lifeboat charity, famously decided to go for consent only. And then I think about a year ago, they just really realised actually that was not really the right way to go. So they've actually switched. And of course, you've then got to be able to keep track of that switch and who's agreed to do what. And generally, lots of computer systems aren't capable of being able to hold on to that information. And then you've got simple things like, the complexity of creating a legitimate interest assessment. So lots of people will go for consent just because they think an LIA looks too hard, even though it may give them greater flexibility. So there's quite a lot of confusion about what you should say, what you should describe, what the process is. And then actually I found with one particular organisation I worked with where we thought we could do legitimate interest, and we went a long way down the road to talk about legitimate interest and actually soft opt-in in particular, then realised the systems they had simply couldn't capture that data. So we had to kind of, reverse back out again and go, fine, okay, we're going to go for consent instead, simply because we couldn't show the information correctly. So I think you end up realizing that organizationally people aren't set up to organize this stuff correctly, and it's not customer data isn't actually at the center of the organization. It tends to sit in lots of siloed buckets. I think that causes all sorts of difficulties.
Of course, and I think, yes, it's really helpful to hear from both of you. You know, these things take time. So people that perhaps haven't tackled all of this before or are tackling it for the first time, just hearing and knowing that actually the easiest route might not necessarily be the best one. As you say, systems might not actually be in place and processes might have to be created in order to support this and to get it right. Steve, I'm sure you've got some examples from the roles that you've been in that you might want to share.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat all the excellent information that we've just heard from Julia and Nick there, because, well, one, we haven't got time, and two, I want to just bring to life two examples where I personally, as a data protection officer, ran into the problems that both Nick and Julia have just mentioned. And the first was around, I'll go in this order because it was logic. When we first started doing the data mining exercise at John Lewis, you know, one of the areas we decided to look into first was how the customer journey and map that customer journey so we could understand all the different data points. And we were told by the architects and various people that we had 6 data entry points, and it turned out to be 21. So there's a classic example of where essentially you go in to do a piece of work, you estimate how long it's going to take, how much effort, and then it's double, if not treble, the amount of effort because there's so many data repositories. And there's data about data, there's metadata, and there's inferences, and there's profiling that gets done left, right, and centre. And I think the siloed bit that Julia mentioned is absolutely spot on. And then the other thing which will make Nick chuckle was our time when we were grappling with the whole lawful basis. And in particular consent or legitimate interest, and we really did have to go down to the minutiae detail on what the impacts, and a word that's come up time and time again and is throughout GDPR text is the word risk, proportionate, risk-based, right? And we had to pull together essentially a very robust reasoning argument as to why we chose to go and re-permission consent for a particular data set of customers at John Lewis and Waitrose. So, you know, 2 examples which both were actually very difficult to do, and you couldn't, I think, as Nick was saying, it wasn't an easy, you don't just look at your data sets and go, oh, that's easy, we're going to rely on consent. It's never like that in the real world. And I think this is the problem that DPOs globally are facing into, even our friends, colleagues in the US, and I know a few of them have joined us this morning, you know, they're with the CCPA. This is a big challenge for most organizations, just knowing where your data is and then knowing what the lawful basis of how you're going to process that data is a big challenge.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's really helpful. So I just want to go back to you, Julia. In terms of individuals, you know, do you think that this area, these principles, are actually making a difference?
I think that's a really good question, actually. I think there's a couple of pros and cons. So firstly, I think there is more control for individuals. So, you know, they should be able to manage their data better. My guess is they probably do have higher awareness of what's being processed, although I do wonder quite how much awareness there is. I think this COVID app discussion that's going on at the moment is quite useful, actually, to get a bit of a debate going on about privacy. But there's 2 downsides. You know, in the end, this legislation is really complicated. And for most normal people in the street, they don't have the bandwidth or the patience to really bother with it too much. And my other concern is it's quite inconsistent. So, you know, are you really going to understand the nuances of consent versus legitimate interest, for instance? And also the ICO themselves have been quite inconsistent about how they're promoting these different legal bases. So their latest marketing guidance, which is supposed to be their best practice guide, is saying you should always use consent, which I don't understand, it's inexplicable, that's not supposed to be how it's been set up. So it's a bit of, it's a 6 and 2 3s, isn't it? Some of it's good, some of it's not so good.
Yeah, absolutely. And, ultimately, I guess back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of maturity, Nick, do you think that it will ultimately be better for individuals and organisations as time goes on?
Yes, I think it will. Look, it's good that if I'm asked for consent, assume, as Steve has alluded to, as Julia has alluded to, it's not obvious which of these conditions necessarily applies. And I absolutely agree with Julia. I mean, look, it's clearly not something that's in public consciousness. Even when you read a paper written specifically about direct marketing by somebody who's involved in direct marketing, the whole kind of consent legitimate interest thing gets kind of muddled very often, as it does on Twitter. All you need to do is read the text from various experts, and there's lots of comments saying, no, it's not like that. And they're often right. Look, I think if I'm asked for consent, I think it's a good thing that we've got some clarity that I should know the organization, the purposes of processing, what data are we talking about. If I change my mind, there's some way of reversing my decision. These are all good things. And that does go to control. I think it's not the aim, it's the engine that's been provided to us that we're all grappling with. Whereas my analogy, these kind of levers are a little clunky at times. And I think it's going to be that way for a while. The only other thing I was going to say, Vickie, is I think it does go, some of the complexity is mitigated by good old fashioned, look, put yourself in the shoes of the data subject. Let's apply a bit of touch and feel to this. How does this feel, and the ICO adopt this approach quite often, does this feel excessive? If it does, it probably is, to quote from their original COVID guidance. Or legitimate interests. If you're doing something that involves data sharing that you weren't before, anything that involves a surprise to the individual, gosh, I didn't realize that's what you were going to use my data for, then that's probably an indication that you need a consent, to be clear, because it's harder to justify that based on legitimate interests. In other words, those good old concepts of reasonable expectations, no surprises, are still, I think, good, and in some way a little bit of a mitigant in dealing with some of the complexity that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Again, as you say, you have to be pragmatic, don't you, really, with something like this, particularly where, as Julia mentioned, that there are so many inconsistencies. And I just wanted to sort of unpack a little bit more about other reasons why organisations might potentially be grappling with this. Steve, would you like to start that one?
Yeah, I think, well, I think it's, again, what's been sort of mentioned, but just to bring that into one sentence, I suppose, I think it goes back to accountability. And what I mean by that, I think, I'm sorry to keep using John Lewis as an example, but one of the biggest, if you like, or greatest outcomes that was achieved whilst I was there was data ownership. And I think up until GDPR was presented to their board, they at first they thought it was a sort of, another AML kind of compliance type of exercise, and yeah, okay, we get this done. But gradually we managed to get the various different data owners, the HR, marketing, etc., to understand that there was a lot more to this, and I think the operational aspects of that is where it gets really hard, and I reckon Julia's spot on there, because I've just recently trained a marketing department on how to do a legitimate interest assessment, and that because they were relying on consent, but it's not always the only basis by which they can process the data, and they needed to understand how, because it's a three-step process, but how do you build that into a business as usual process? It's hard enough doing a data protection impact assessment and getting that embedded throughout an organization. So I'm picking up on a word that Nick said, clunky. I think is probably good. Clunky is a good description, and I think what we're doing as data protection officers and advisors supporting our data protection officer network is trying to just put a little bit of oil in or grease it up a little bit to help it sort of slide into gear, if you like, you know. And I think that's why it feels so hard. But my big tip for all of our listeners would be about data ownership and essentially accountability, making people feel responsible and taking that ownership of their data sets that they have responsibility for, I think is the key to all of this, personally. Excellent,
thanks, Steve. Before we start to think about what good looks like, Julia or Nick, did you have anything to add to what Steve's just talked about?
So I just wanted to say that lots of organisations just simply don't treat it like a priority. And in fact, probably will only treat it as a priority if something bad happens. So if they get fined. So in fact, I sit on the board of a company that did get fined, and they suddenly took it much more seriously because there's that external threat. But my other observation is that particularly in industries that rely on technology, then you've got a complex workflow and process, and you've got to be able to understand how the data flows through that. And I've done quite a lot of work in the ad tech space, which is a kind of great example of that. And the other complexity there is that you're dealing with developers who work in an agile fashion. And so for them, agile doesn't really equate with writing DPIAs or legitimate interest assessments. So you've got real difficulties culturally around dealing with these groups of people who want to get on with it, whilst we're saying, well, hold on a minute, we just need to understand where the data's flowing. And I think in the ad tech space in particular, back to the point about consent versus legitimate interest, lots of the operators in that space simply don't understand which is consent and which is legitimate interest. The ICO ended up having to point out that everything was probably based on consent, even though lots of people are still arguing that maybe you can use legitimate interest to process personal data through ad tech vendor systems.
That's a really, really good points there, Julia, particularly around sort of industry to industry and some that, you know, quite frequently haven't actually come up against something like this before, and it would be quite a huge change program for them that is going to take quite considerable time. Nick, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, just to say, I agree on that point that Julia made about the direct marketing code, and there's also some guidance from Europe in similar vein that that really it should all be consent, and particularly where you've got device-based data triggering the e-privacy rules on the one hand, and a direct marketing campaign associated with that. You should sort of, you know, put it all in the same bucket and just treat it as consent. But of course, that's not what the law says. They are separate. That's the whole point. There are completely separate laws. So there's been debate on this rumbling for a few years as to, well, why can't we have consent for privacy, e-privacy on the one hand, and legitimate interests or another condition under GDPR, and it does. And I think the other point I was going to make was, I think the challenge we've got is, as Julia quite rightly says, you've got the business guys saying, let's get on with it, let's do it, we have deadlines, we need to move. And in the privacy community, we've got all the principles and the rules, but what we haven't got, or at least I think it's still kind of under, you know, development, is a clear machine to get you from A to B to C on this. And therefore the real challenge is to design your own machine for your own organization to fit your own risk level. And I know that sounds very sort of DIY, but actually at least that gets us to the next level. And it's got to be justifiable and defensible, and that actually is the approach that we have taken with a number of clients to ensure that we have that control framework in place, and as I say, it's defensible. So is the key point.
Thanks, Nick. And you know, the next question that I was going to ask really was around what good looks like, and just listening to what you've both talked about, you know, I feel like we should not just be looking at what does good look like for an organization, but what can be done now, to the point that you've just made, Nick, you know, a risk-based approach potentially, and what good would look like for everyone. Well, potentially that is, you know, when the regulators are actually sort of fully aligned and harmonized, and things are potentially clearer. Would that be what you think?
For me, I mean, in theory, yes, but I think, you know, we live in the real world. You've got different regulators taking very different approaches. The EU is not a single thing, and soon we're not going to be in it. So, it's a complex, you know, different kind of cultural approaches. That's why I say, I mean, look, another way to look at this is to think about certification, privacy seals and certification marks, and kind of take some of the heat out of the debate and standardize in that way. But I mean, frankly, whatever way you do it, and they're not here yet, so we need to do it ourselves right now. There needs to be an effort to do what I was saying, which is to design a process that makes sense for that organization. And that's the idea, I guess, behind a control framework, policies, procedures, and so on. But it's you know, I mean, the nice thing is there's flexibility to design what works for the organization. But that, I mean, inevitably that comes with a challenge, and it does pose risks, as Julia rightly says, because you still, you know, it's not like the conversation with the business stops while we all get to design our system.
Yeah,
that would be in theory, but it ain't gonna happen.
Thanks, Nick. Julia, any builds on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nick's point about creating your own governance framework. I think you've got to find a way of working that works for your company, and in a way engages with the different teams, so that you actually pull together those different interest groups and get them talking to each other. My other key point is really about not being afraid to declutter. So I was thinking about, you know, you could do a Marie Kondo on your data. It's like you must not be afraid to throw it away. I mean, the number of times I've had conversations about, you know, clearing out databases and throwing data away, or, you know, obviously deleting it carefully and securely, and people are reluctant to do that. It's like, well, but why? It's from a commercial point of view, it doesn't do anything for your business. Why are you keeping it? I simply don't understand it. So I think decluttering is important. And then the other thing, and I think marketers sometimes struggle with this, is to have a data strategy really sorted out in advance. Now that runs counter to the agile working point again, and you see lots of marketing teams talking about agile marketing, but in actual fact, you've got to have an overarching data strategy to really get clear about what you're going to do with your data and how you're going to manage it. And I think that feels countercultural quite often. And so, you know, encouraging that kind of strategizing, not getting really, you know, heavy duty about it, but actually getting people to think about it in terms of principles is a useful way to work.
No, I think those are really, really great points, Julia. And as you say, you know, both of you have mentioned data strategy, control framework. So it's bigger than just privacy. It is about the company's data. So there's a need to sort of fully align with anybody else in the organisation that has ownership for it. I think those things are probably really important. Steve, did you have anything to add to that before we go to answer a few questions from the audience?
Just two very quick points. I think the question of enforcement or approaches to enforcement across Europe and the varying different ways that their different data protection authorities are focusing in on different things creates this uncertainty. So for the client that I'm looking after at the moment, which is in 18 countries in Europe, I've got to take into consideration the German approach as opposed to the Hungarian approach, and that adds to that already complex situation. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then the second thing, I think Nick mentioned about certifications and seals, and I do think that is going to be possibly the only way. And we're going to have to create good enough, if you like. But I really like the points that Julia is saying, and sort of corresponds with what Nick was saying about this. Well, Nick called it the onion, peeling back the multiple layers of the onion, which is a great analogy, but also knowing what you're going after. So if you are going to peel that back, have a strategy, understand what the end goal is, what the outcomes are, and your objectives. And I think that's the thing that that's how you measure good enough, if you like, or what does good look like. It's having a clear in your mind about where it is you want to be, and what your objectives are, so that you can then work to it, and you can reflect and you can build KPIs into that. So it's just about sort of, there is the NIST, the new NIST privacy framework, there's the ISO standard, there's a plethora of different control frameworks that can be used if you want to hang your hat on those, but I would say that it is a sort of horses for courses approach, given that we're still hell-bent on only discovering these bad people that ultimately get caught and have breaches, and then the enforcement comes in. So I think there's a bit of a different approach needed by the data protection authorities across Europe, and I think that's the problem. We're still in this mentality of with someone coming around banging us, cracking the whip, if you like, rather than going, well, hang on, let's work with you in a proactive way to understand what you're trying to do with the data, and then you can build that in.
Excellent, thank you, Steve. So we have got a few questions that have come in from the audience, so I'm just going to see if we can answer a couple before the end. I'm actually going to start with this one that says, is it all really that hard, or is it a classic case of people really not liking what they're going to hear?
Great question.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
Does someone pick that up?
I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? Because yes, there is certainly, sometimes there are situations where, the correct answer is X, and that's not a welcome consequence or outcome. But I think it is quite hard, actually. Although I would distinguish, if you look at some of the guidance, and there's been some kind of overview videos of how to do all this. It can be made to look very simple, and I think for some businesses, maybe smaller businesses with one product line, yeah, sure. I mean, it's easier to explain what you're going to do with the data just through from transparency to legal basis and so on. I think the challenge is more for big businesses where there's 110 product lines, they're constantly changing, or it's agile, as we've kind of talked about, and it's a venture tech, a startup where the end point, direction of travel is clear, the end point isn't. These are quite complex, I would say. So, it's not absolutely always the case. That's a fair point.
Great, thanks, Nick. Good points there. Julia, did you have anything to add to that?
I think sometimes as privacy professionals, we probably make it a little bit harder for our clients than we could do. I think we're effectively speaking another language to lots of people, and particularly if you go and talk to marketers, then they definitely have blank faces when you start talking about some of this stuff. So I think it is incumbent on us as advisors to try to explain it in straightforward layman's language as well as we can, in order to make it seem not hard. And that is quite difficult sometimes, because I think you then need to try and couch it in the way in which they run their business, so that they can actually reference it back to what their own activities are. And I think that's one of the key things. And I think, Steve, in your consultancy, you spend a lot of time on this, is actually thinking about, well, how do you embed this stuff in the culture of the organisation? There's a big plug for you. Channel 4 had a great case study on how they embedded it into their culture. And I think there's a lot more work we could do in order to communicate more effectively about how it is important for customers, and how marketers should be worrying about that when they're communicating with their customers. So I think there's work we can do to make it better.
Great points, Julia, great points. So another one here around other laws. Is it inconsistent, or is there a difference between what an answer would be with a PECA hat on versus a GDPR hat on when it comes to marketing?
So this is the point we were talking about earlier, which is PECA will say if it's anything to do with device-based data like cookies, you need consent unless it's essential for the delivery of the service or specifically requested. Whereas GDPR doesn't say that, because it's not dealing with marketing, it's dealing with processing generally, of which marketing is a subset. So the quick answer is, I would say yes, there is a potentially different answer in terms of is it legitimate interests or consent, but legally they are, as I said before, they're completely separate laws and sets of rules, although we can see, as Julia has mentioned rightly, the regulators trying to conjoin them and enhance effectively both regimes.
Thanks, Nick. So just to build on that a little bit, Julia, how would people actually manage that then if they're having to look at those two separate laws and there are potentially inconsistencies?
So certainly around cookies, when GDPR came out, then the basis on which people were collecting cookies effectively changed overnight. Now, it took the ICO a year to come up with their guidance to explain the impact of GDPR. So if you imagine you need to gain consent, but actually it's GDPR level consent, which is more granular and more rigorous, we've already discussed it, then that makes life more difficult. So implied consent pretty much went out of the window, and most people's cookie policies became illegal overnight, and cookie notices. So in fact, I think people are still grappling with it, because you've got all sorts of different ways in which people are presenting their cookie notices. Lots of them are still illegal. Is the ICO going after people? I've seen no evidence of it so far. I think they will get around to it eventually. But it also has created problems with the advertising industry, because the consent has changed, the basis for consent has changed. So I think it becomes a little bit of a moving feast, and I think it's taken people quite a long time to grapple with it and get their heads around it. And certainly, even I found it quite difficult to get my head around. You know, you need consent to drop cookies, and then can you use legitimate interest to create segments and profile audiences, as a for instance? Lots of people would say no.
Right.
So they start a big debate about, well, could you use legitimate interest to profile an audience or not, or create a segment or not? Let's not debate that now, but it's those kind of discussions that will end up coming up with a number of different answers. So in the ICO ad tech update last year, in the room, all these privacy professionals were arguing about, well, what is the legal basis for creating segments? So I think it's very difficult. And also, the ICO's interpretation of the law has definitely erred on the strict side. So if you go to different territories, they have a slightly different view about what you need consent for, just to make it a bit complicated.
It is terribly confusing, and that was my point I was trying to make a little bit earlier. About how the different data protection authorities around Europe are approaching this. You know, there was the case where the Dutch data protection authority went back and changed its mind for the tennis association, the Dutch Tennis Association, and you know, so you're left kind of scratching your head, because you know, what do you do then? If you go in, you get some advice, you go off, or you build something, you start doing it, and then, you know, half a year later or so, they come back and go, "No, actually, we've had a little bit more of a think about this. We're now going to fine you," which seems a tad unfair. But I think this goes back to the statements that we've often made on these weekly chats, which is, this is still nascent. This industry, we are learning. We're you know, and we're growing with this, if you like, of how and when. And as Nick used to say to me often, it depends. Yeah, so
you're giving away my secrets.
I've learned from the Jedi.
Excellent, thanks, Steve. So we're just in the closing minutes now. I know we've got a couple more questions, but it might be possible that we can look at those offline, Steve, and perhaps try and answer them for the audience. Because I think what I'd really like the audience to hear are some closing remarks from both Julia and Nick in terms of, you know, what are the key nuggets of advice that you would like to leave people with?
What nuggets? I would say, you know, I think it is, as we talked about, it's quite a complex machine, this kind of concept, particularly around the gateway conditions. I think the important thing is not to be put off by that, to design and road test. I mean, I guess it'll have been done to a large extent, but keep road testing that and keep maintaining and improving. There's always a need keep it closely in touch with the regulator. So, and in the UK, maybe that's just the ICO. Maybe you need to worry about regulators elsewhere too, to ensure that what you're doing is still good practice, because the goalposts are constantly moving on this. And I think underpinning some of the assessment, it is, as I said, in relation to legitimate interest, really important to think about reasonable expectations, and for your organization, where the guardrails are, or maybe the correct word is parameters. So if you want to do anything in this zone, we're in the safe zone. Where do we start to get less comfortable, whatever the kind of legal reason for that is, and ensure that that distinction is clear. And of course, then you can think about embedding that in the organization, training, awareness, and so on. But I'm just thinking about it within the data privacy community as a starting point. I think those are all, hopefully, helpful guidelines.
Excellent, really helpful guidelines, Nick. Thank you so much. And Julia?
So it's really important to listen to the priorities in the business and understand what it is they're trying to achieve. And I think that then gives you a better idea of what privacy and data protection measures you need to put in place to protect the business. Because the fact of the matter is, you can't treat everything as being a high priority. You are going to have to prioritize your activities. So I think that's one key point. And then understanding the workflows around the organization is important, because you can't rely on the organization to have figured that out for themselves. And then finally, I'm quite a big fan of the decluttering. I think you need to make sure that you've got programs in place to get rid of that dodgy data or the risky data, because actually having that data puts your business at risk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julia, and for both of our guests for their honest, pragmatic advice. Really, really clear, really, really helpful. Steve, any closing remarks from you?
Just two. You'll be pleased to hear. So, as you know, I can go on. I've said it first. I'd say it's sort of building on what both our wonderful guests have said today. I think things about creating playbooks is a really good way to present it and to give that guidance. Second, obviously, would be about driving that culture of privacy throughout your organization. And I'm not just saying that because we're called privacy culture. I'm genuinely believe in changing the whole mindset about this to make it a positive thing, a positive experience, and so that people want to come and want to engage with their DPOs. So that would be my two.
Excellent, thank you, Steve, and thanks again to our guests. It's fantastic to have you both on the show today. And next week we'll be back at the same time, and we're focusing on third parties. I believe that's right, isn't it? Data processes and third parties. So we'll have some more guests. So we'll see you then. So have a wonderful weekend and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.